What's up, guys? I'm Ryan Roberts. Welcome into tonight's At Large Bid Bearcats podcast, brought to you by Riverfront U. Tonight, we're joined by Mo Ager. Mo, welcome into the show.
Ryan, it's good to be with you. What's going on?
Not much, man. Like we were talking about off the air, getting ready for Big 12 Media Days this week. Figured we'd come on and talk about the Bearcats football program a little bit. Cincinnati coming off a 30-10 loss to Iowa State Saturday, their fourth consecutive loss. Where are you right now with this team, Mo?
Well, in a little bit different place than I was last week, and during the bye, I spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about how in spite of the three straight losses, in spite of how things unfolded against Miami and Oklahoma and against BYU, that there was enough to build on, that they could still have, I think, what most of us would deem a successful season. Most of us went into the year going, okay, if they can win 6 games, maybe 7, play in a bowl, pretty good, right? And I think if you look at the back half of the schedule, there are, there's no Texas, there's no TCU for what it's worth. TCU certainly doesn't seem to be great this year, but they're playing Baylor and Iowa State and West Virginia and Houston, and I sort of separate Kansas a little bit, UCF. There's some winnable games there. And I walked out of the BYU game going, you know what? There's something to build on here. Yes. They have struggled in the red zone. And yes, they've had issues, not so much against BYU, but they've had issues on 3rd and short. And yeah, they've got to clean up some mistakes, but they were moving the ball. I mean, hell, they had almost 500 yards of total offense against BYU. Yeah. They moved the ball reasonably well against Oklahoma. Defensively, they did more than you could ever ask against the Sooners. And, they were dominant early in the game against BYU. And so my thinking was, clean up some of that stuff, do the little things better, execute better inside the 20. This team could be okay. And then what I watched on Saturday was beyond sobering. And you could sort of sense it from the get-go when Emory Jones missed a wide open D. Wiggins on the first drive of the game. You just had the sense this wasn't going to be their day, and it was every phase. Offensively, I don't understand. Iowa State plays that 3-3-5 defense. We saw Cincinnati play that for years, and its weakness was against the run. Bearcats really couldn't run it effectively if it didn't involve Emory Jones. He missed a lot of really easy throws, quite frankly. Defensively, they weren't great. They give up a 20-yard run on 4th and 1. There's the roughing the passer penalty. There's all the special teams issues we saw. Bad kick returns, execution in the return game when they try to pooch a kick and it's not done well. The fake field goal. It just was as thorough a bad performance as you could expect, coming off a bye in what many of us deemed a must-win situation. It was really, really sobering. And now I certainly understand it if you're starting to turn the page to next year. And obviously that's where the quarterback conversation sort of goes. But I've gone from thinking, you know what, this team can still take off, to wondering, are they good enough to clean up their mistakes? We've watched a half season of this team shrinking its own margin for error, and they haven't done it. I think you're being reasonable if you wonder, between now and the end of the season, if they haven't done it yet, are they ever going to do it? And if they don't, what might that record look like at the end of the year?
I think one of the biggest topics right now when you're looking at Cincinnati football, Emory Jones, obviously a quarterback who's really struggled over the last 4 games, 7 interceptions, 14 of 26 for 96 yards and 2 interceptions against Iowa State, completing just 56% of his passes during the losing streak. If you're Scott Satterfield, at what point do you start looking to maybe make a change to turn things around or just shake things up?
Yeah, I think it's really tough, because I know a lot of people want them to move on from Emory right now. And I get it, right? He played poorly. He hasn't played great. He doesn't represent the future of this program. And so I understand it. At the same time, none of us have to manage a locker room. And so I wonder, if you turn the page, does that represent bailing on the season? Or if you turn the page to a different quarterback, does that breathe some life into the team? I don't know. A good coach, at least, has their finger on the pulse of the team. So I think if you're Scott Satterfield or any coach and you're weighing a change at quarterback, which is a big, big decision, I think you have to have a sense of how it positively or adversely is going to affect your team. I don't have that sense. I don't know. What I do know is this. below average play at any position can't continue. And so I could certainly understand if you don't want to be the coach who goes, you know what, he played poorly. And, you mentioned the numbers. He's had bad plays in those other games. The Iowa State game was the first time that I felt like top to bottom, he played poorly.
Mm-hmm.
If you're Scott Satterfield, do you want to send the message that one bad game and I'm moving on? Maybe, maybe not. But I do think you have to start thinking about shortening the leash where, okay, we get into a game against Baylor, which is winnable. If the offense just isn't working, they already showed a willingness to move on to Brady Lichtenberg, frankly, in garbage time, but they did pull the trigger. They did bench Emory, and he wasn't happy about it, and I don't blame him. I think if you're the coaching staff, that at least has to be a part of the thinking for Saturday. If the level of performance is the same, we've got to be willing to move on. We can't lose another game at home because our quarterback, and it's not all Emory's fault by any stretch
Right.
what we saw on Saturday, but are we going to lose another game because our quarterback is not holding up his end of the bargain? I don't think you can do that. And so I would go into it thinking, hopefully he plays great and gets the season back on track. But based on what we just saw, and I think based on what we've come to understand as a reasonably limited ceiling as a player, Emory's a okay college quarterback. Let's be honest. He's not great. I don't think he's as bad as he was on Saturday. I don't know that you're willing to totally hit the eject button on him because we're not even to November yet. But again, if the poor play continues, and I think any reasonable assessment of his play against Iowa State would conclude he played poorly. If that continues in that game, you've got to be willing to move on. And then go from there and deal with whatever the fallout is after that game ends.
Right. So we talk about quarterback play, but when you assess up front, when we spoke in the preseason, we said the two biggest contributors to the Bearcats' success this year would be quarterback play and offensive line. Saturday, offensive line in the run game, they give up 6 tackles for loss and 2 sacks. How much of Emory's play do you think can be contributed to maybe the offensive line being overwhelmed in year one of the Big 12?
Could be. It can't help but be a factor. Tony Pike and Jim Kelly on the radio broadcast talked about Emory looked like he had lost confidence. And when you've lost confidence as a quarterback, it's hard to get it back. And maybe part of that is a byproduct of playing behind that offensive line. The offensive line to me this year has been kind of weird because the Pitt game, and say what you want about Pitt as an opponent, but I think the big takeaway for most of us from that game was, boy, the Bearcats physically stood toe-to-toe with that Pittsburgh team, which a Pat Narduzzi team, you expect them to be physical, and the Bearcats stood toe-to-toe. And then, the Miami game, specifically inside the 20 and really specifically inside the 5, they kind of got pushed around. And then we saw them move the ball against Oklahoma and move the ball against BYU, but specifically against Oklahoma and all those short yardage situations, they got pushed around. So we've seen the offensive line. I keep talking about this. If you go back to the fourth quarter of the Miami game and then the entire Oklahoma game and the entire BYU game, that's, if you include overtime, that's basically 10 periods of football. They gained 1,000 yards, like just shy of 1,000 yards. You don't do that with awful offensive line play.
Right.
But in the short yardage situations specifically, all those 3rd and 2s, all those 4th and 2s they had against Oklahoma in the red zone, they've been pushed around. And then, the thing for me about Iowa State was they were losing 5-on-3. It's not the same defense necessarily, but Iowa State plays that 3-3-5.
Right.
When Cincinnati played that 2 years ago, when they were really, really good, the one thing that they were susceptible to were teams that could really run it against them. And some of those games that year, even though they went undefeated, were maybe a little bit closer than you would have expected because teams did have some success, running the football. It's the weakness of the 3-3-5. The Bearcats couldn't exploit that weakness. Is that play calling? Maybe. Is it flat out execution by Emory or the running backs? Sure. But more than anything, it was an indictment against the offensive line. And so that unit to me has been so up and down that I'll stop short of saying they've been bad. I don't agree with the assessment that they have been, but they're good enough to put themselves in a position to look awful in short yardage and in red zone. And then on Saturday against Iowa State, I don't know how you don't conclude that they were bad, because they got physically beaten up against the team that was dropping 8 into coverage and begging them to run, and the Bearcats could really neither throw it or pass it.
Yeah, I think one of the most frustrating things for fans is you look at the stats. The stats don't indicate a team that's 2-4 right now. Coming into the Iowa State game, averaging 490 yards of total offense, which is good for third in the Big 12, second in the Big 12 in total defense. So one thing that I brought up to Scott Satterfield Saturday post game was, the front three of Juwan Briggs, Malik Van, Eric Phillips, and Dante Corleone, that combo, they're getting really good pressure, but it seems like they're maybe lacking that speed guy from the edge to get in there and get to the quarterback and cause turnovers. What are your thoughts on that, as far as maybe lacking that speed guy off the edge to speed up a young quarterback to force him into mistakes?
Yeah, that group as a whole hasn't wreaked havoc, right? The way you would expect. We talked about that being the strength of the team, and I don't know that any of those players are having bad years, but you haven't often seen, and it's not like they've played against a bunch of mobile quarterbacks either. You really haven't seen that many instances in which the other team's QB has been under constant duress. I think of 2020 when Myjai Sanders was just so disruptive, right? And it felt like, especially immobile quarterbacks, there were just these large swaths of time where the offense couldn't get anything going because Myjai was just wreaking havoc because he was so good coming off the edge. And I think more so in 2020 than 2021. I've noticed that as well, that it just, they've been. We talked about this in the pregame show against BYU. They had the first 4 possessions on defense. There were 3 3-and-outs. And I think on the first one, they might have given up a first down. And that's great. They're forcing punts, but there's nothing really disruptive, right? They're not putting teams in like second and long and third and long because they're creating a lot of havoc. We see it at times. Daniel Greshik was one of the few bright spots against Iowa State. But they're also not forcing turnovers. And, again, against BYU and against Oklahoma, there were times where there were a lot of things to like about their defense. But with the way this offense runs, it would be great to have some short yardages or short yardage drives, and the defense simply hasn't put them in those positions. And so, yeah, I think you hit on something that would be great. If I think we're sort of seeing what life is like with 2 things. You don't have a real speed guy coming off the edge, and also you don't have a shutdown corner, So those 2 things, in spite of what they do have defensively, those things in this league, at some point, I guess, are going to get exposed.
I think it's interesting you bring up the shutdown corner, because we've seen often on third downs where a team will just throw the ball up and try to exploit the sideline, and they get that call with pass interference because maybe the secondary isn't athletic enough to cover these receivers right now, or maybe it has to do with scheme. Maybe they're doing too much zone, and they just don't have the athletic cornerbacks to get back there and cover that. And I think you bring up the turnovers. It's interesting because Iowa State, obviously, they were going to lose regardless. But BYU, 2 turnovers contribute to 14 points for them.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the third down issues, do you think it has more to do with what they're trying to do on first and second down, or is it just a lack of execution altogether?
Well, the ones that really stand out are the third and shorts. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but against Oklahoma, there were 3 third and 2s and 3 fourth and 2s. They converted first downs on neither. That's almost impossible to do if you just look at things mathematically. They were good on third down against BYU. They had some sustained drives. They did a good job of bouncing back after the Emory Jones pick 6, put the team in a position to, they should have had the lead or at least been tied at halftime. And then, the defense kind of melted down very quickly in that last minute. I just think it's lack of execution on third and shorts. Look, it's hard to get upset when you're not converting 3rd and 10. That's a byproduct of lack of success on first and second down. But where it's gotten frustrating has been on, the 3rd and short and 4th and short situations where they've had to turn the ball over on downs or they haven't been able to execute. And that to me has been reflective of the offensive line more than anything. And, maybe Emery's missed a throw or missed a hole here or there. But as I think about it, I'm kind of talking about this on a macro level. I'm sure there are exceptions. When I think about their third down issues, for the most part, they have felt like third and makeable, third and manageable, and they can't execute, specifically in the other team's territory. And most of the time after a play, where I'm most frustrated is with the inability to block.
So obviously a new staff this season. At what point does that excuse go away that, well, it is a new staff, we're still trying to implement different things week to week? At what point do you kind of look at each other and say, hey, we have to shake things up, not only personnel wise, but maybe the way we're doing things?
Well, I think that the first year excuse, if that's the word you want to use, that applies to the first year because it's true.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, you want to see improvement. You want to see adjustment. You want to see changes if something isn't working. And so yeah, I think that's going to be really worth paying attention to here in the second half of the season. And, look, they may play great against Baylor, may play great against Oklahoma State, then no changes are necessary, and here we go. But if what we saw on Saturday is reflective of how things are going to come, or how things are going to go in the coming weeks, as a coaching staff, you're not doing your job if you don't adjust to that, if you don't make changes to it, if you don't, whether it's do some schematic changes or some personnel changes, or, even make some changes that are behind closed doors that we don't necessarily get a chance to see play out in front of us. You need to see, it's a Bengals thing, but I remember thinking in 2020, when Joe Burrow got hurt, the Bengals won 2 games with backup quarterbacks, one on Monday night against the Pittsburgh Steelers with Ryan Finley. And I remember thinking, like, that really reflects well on the coaching staff. They figured it out. Like, they figured out a way to win a game with a guy who's probably not going to be in the league in a year. The team is bad. It's been an awful season, but the coaching staff figured something out here. They worked with what they had, and they achieved something that night that nobody would have seen coming. Give me a situation like that. Let's see individual and collective improvement before we completely bag on the coaching staff. They have a half a season to go. But the obvious answer, I think it's never been more difficult to be a coach in a new place because of the portal, because of the ease with which players can go.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's ever been more difficult. And then you add to it moving up a level in competition. I also think it's never been easier to get things turned around in year 2 for the exact same reason. We can go and get guys, right? We're not going to do the 4 or 5 year plan anymore. You're going to be given in this day and age, hey, look, a short amount of time, we'll give you year 1, year 2. We need to start to see it. And I think, unfortunately, for this staff, you could say, well, they move into an unenviable position because of the staff they took over for. Well, the staff they took over for started winning year 2, and really started to make you feel like, holy crap, I can see where this is going to go. I mean, I remember emphatically after the first game of Luke Fickell's second year going, look at all those young players who played against UCLA. Look at all these guys who are going to be a big part of this team moving forward. And most of those dudes were the backbone of undefeated teams, NFL guys. We need to see that next year. Quite frankly, I think every fan would agree with that. Does that mean they win 10 games or 11 games next season? Maybe not necessarily, but I don't know that we're going to be sitting here a year from now if they're 2-4 and we see performances like we did against Iowa State and just shrug our shoulders and go, well, golly gee, it's the new Big 12. It's staff took over. No, it doesn't work that way. I think it's never been more difficult to be a first year head coach in any situation. I think it's never been easier to get things turned around after that first year because you can turn over the talent very, very quickly. And so I think that's going to be the expectation. But for this team this year, let's talk after 12 games and go, okay, what were they week 12 or game 12 versus game 6? And if the answer is more of the same and the mistakes weren't fixed and we saw a lot of the errors that have shrunken this team's margin for error, if we keep seeing those things, that's going to reflect poorly on the coaching staff. if we see things continue to spiral out of control, and then some personnel changes are made, or they change how they play, or they overhaul a position group with younger guys on the roster, or a dude who's not playing a lot starts to get more playing time, and that yields positive results, we're going to say that reflects well on the coaching staff. If the team as a whole, takes this point where it feels like things are starting to crumble a little bit, and they bounce back and have a couple of crisp performances and play well, we're going to go, well, that reflects well on the coaching staff. But yeah, what looms over all of this is the incredible challenge of year one, new league. It's really, really difficult, but within that framework, you could still expect a coaching staff to improve the team and make changes where needed as the season evolves.
Do you think this schedule and league are maybe better than people expected, given the recent success of this program?
Maybe. I think what we might fail to realize are two things. One, how good the teams were in 19, 20, and 21, and even to a small degree last year. Last year's team felt like it kind of underachieved, but it's they went into the last week of the year with a chance to go to the conference championship game. What I hope now, I've thought about this a lot, watching people on social media. Like, I hope now there's an appreciation for how hard it is to win and how good those teams were, because I feel like in real time, some were so caught up in the rankings and what some pundits said about them not making the playoffs. And I remember like 2 years ago, I'm going like, guys, this team's really good, like really good. Doesn't mean they're going to blow everybody out. I hope now that there's some appreciation for how good that team is, but also that this is just a better conference. Like, Iowa State's not great. They may finish with a winning record. Matt Campbell's a very good coach, but that's not a very good team. Over the last couple of years, that Iowa State team that we watched, it would win a lot of games in the American Athletic Conference. Ain't going to win a ton in the Big 12. So it's just a better league. So I think what has happened is, when they moved to the Big 12, when that was announced, Cincinnati had just gone 13-0. And so you're thinking, great, Big 12 with that team. Well, okay, well, you're going to have that team in 2 years. They don't. And so I think the level of competition has been a bit of a rude awakening. At the same time, it's the Big 12 schedule makers could not have done them more of a favor. I mean, BYU's not great. Iowa State's not great. Texas is. They're not playing them. They at least got Oklahoma at home. There's no Kansas State on the schedule. There's no Texas Tech on the schedule. But sure, I think there's maybe the sobering, reality setting in that, oh yeah, going to the Big 12 is cool, but oh boy, the bottom half of the Big 12 is exponentially better than the bottom half of the American Athletic Conference.
We kind of hit on it earlier with the special team struggles on Saturday. That's something we haven't seen. Heading into the Baylor game, obviously both teams 2-4, winnable game. What are you looking to see on both sides of the ball to show that this team is improving and they can bounce back from a tough loss like that?
Well, you got to clean up the special team stuff. Look, the Braden Smith muffed punt against BYU might have been the biggest play of the game. That was a special teams play. And then, what we saw against Iowa State, kick return game, field goal unit with the fake. None of it worked. That stuff, this team is not good enough to overcome that stuff. They just, their margin for error is very, very short. I think what I want to see more than anything is I want to see Emory Jones respond. This is the first real scrutiny he's gotten, and there's, going to be legitimate calls for there to be a quarterback change. I want to see if this week can be used for him to regain his confidence. And if it's not, boy, I'm fearful that we see a repeat of what we saw against Iowa State. And in another game, the Bearcats are favored to win. Now you wonder if they do. And then I want to start to see this defensive line really impose itself, because this was supposed to be the strength of the team. And we've seen it at times. We haven't seen it as much as we would like. Without the benefit of having really done a deep dive into what Baylor is going to bring to the table up front. we all thought if the Bearcats had a chance to be good this year, it was going to come because that defensive line really imposed itself. It's been
Mhm.
good at times. It's been stout at times. It hasn't been consistently good, and it hasn't been disruptive, and it certainly was neither of those things against Iowa State. You've got to start to see that. And again, I offensively, I want to see if there are things that can allow Emory to regain his confidence because the first drive he misses the long pass downfield, the second drive he throws a pick, and then from that point forward, you just got the sense he was tentative and he was playing scared. I've never played quarterback in my life. I don't think you can play the position that way. And if he plays that way moving forward, it's going to be a problem.
Game one, Emory's 19 of 23. Just has a storybook start to his Cincinnati career. But I think if you look at that first game, you look at his average yards per pass, it was 15.3. You look at the past 5 games, and he's around 5 to 7 yards. Do you think maybe, and this was obviously the topic heading into this game, do you think maybe the lack of explosive plays and taking more deep shots maybe has an effect on this offense?
Could although I think of plays against both Oklahoma and obviously the D Wiggins one, which stood out on Saturday, where there have been a handful of times where Emory's had a guy downfield and simply hasn't made the throw. I think from a usage and statistical standpoint, the way that Xavier Henderson started the season. And the way he played against Miami, you would have thought, dude, this guy's going to be a huge part of what they do. Did he play against Iowa State? Box score would say he didn't. My takeaway from the first game, I think I even put it on social media, was Bearcats have some dudes on the outside. They haven't taken advantage of them. Not to the extent that they should. And part of that is when they are open, the quarterback's got to get them the football. That's been pretty sobering. I thought I thought they had some talent on that team. We talked about it on the radio broadcast. That was, we said all offseason, such an unknown because you had all these guys coming from all over the place. And after the first couple of games, you thought, okay, like they've got some guys there. Where have they been? And is it merely a byproduct of Emory not making the throws? I don't know. But, you could say, well, they should throw the deep ball more. Yeah, but your quarterback has to make the pass, especially when the guy is wide open. But I think relative to what a lot of us thought after that first game, it's been disappointing seeing the lack of downfield production from some talented wide receivers dry up.
Well, and I think it's interesting that you bring up the wide receiver talent because I don't know that we've seen consistent play from any of them either.
No.
Shimon Mateer, he's the only guy that it seems like Emory is consistently targeted, and even Shimon has had drops over the past 2 games. Obviously 3 touchdowns, but he's had some crucial drops. Do you think maybe you bring up Xavier Henderson? Do you think maybe they need to do a better job scheming to get him in more one-on-one situations? Because you look at certain points during the Oklahoma and BYU games, he was unguardable, but then they go away from him. Do you think they need to do a better job scheming to get him the ball more?
Yeah. A player of his physical gifts, I'll go back to the Miami game when they had all the issues scoring close to the goal line. And I remember once or twice thinking, like, every team in college football has like the back shoulder end zone fade jump ball, like get it to him. And they didn't. And from that point forward, it's felt like he's taken on a lesser role, but what he was doing hasn't been replaced by anybody with maybe the exception of Shimon Mateer. They have guys who can play. I think they have guys on the outside who could play. When you're not getting the ball to them, I think the first place you look is quarterback, and then you go, okay, schematically, are there things we could do? And for me, I would look more closer to the goal line than anywhere else to maybe take advantage of some of those, I think, mismatches that you can create. But, Xavier looked like the greatest wide receiver I'd ever seen against Miami. And since then, he has 10 catches. He had 7 against BYU. And again, was a non-factor against Iowa State. That is an Iowa State team that plays a defense that, they drop 7 or 8 into coverage and they confuse you and there's dudes all over the place. But still, that's the job of a coaching staff. Figure out a way to adjust. And if you're not going to run the ball against them, that tells me you think you can get guys open. And against Iowa State, they could not.
One I think the concerns I had going into the Iowa State game was during Emory's presser that Tuesday, one of the first things he mentions is he had never played against a 3-3-5. And that's the first thing he mentions. And then you look at Iowa State's defense, I think they were either third or fifth in the country in interceptions with 10, only team in the country with multiple guys with 3 or more interceptions. Given that, you would think that, hey, the game plans, we need to run, get Corey the ball. I think him and Miles touched a combined 12 times.
Yeah.
And you would think in a situation like that where your quarterback is saying that, hey, I haven't seen this defense much, you would think you would come out of the gate running the ball more, right?
Yeah, I was thinking during the game, the Bearcats won the game. 2021, they played at Tulane, and the game was kind of janky. It was an 11 a.m. start, and Tulane ran the ball effectively. Now, you started to maybe see the seeds being planted of a Tulane team that the following year would end up winning the league and winning a big bowl game, but it was the weakness of the 3-3-5. And we kind of dealt with it because okay, you're not going to throw towards Sauce. The secondary is awesome. They're playing a 3-3-5. Go ahead and run it against them. And we know you want to keep their offense off the field, but so you go, okay, you're playing Iowa State. Well, what I've come to know about the 3-3-5 from watching UC play it was you can run it against them. And we all just 2 years ago shrugged our shoulders and said, oh, well, at times do you come out of the 3-3-5, bring up another guy to the line of scrimmage? Because remember the whole thing with Alabama, like how are you going to play Alabama playing a 3-3-5, right? Well,
yeah.
So watching the game on Saturday, I kept thinking like, shouldn't they be able to run the ball against these guys? And by the way, they ran it effectively earlier this season. Corey Kiner has 2 100-yard games. Ryan Montgomery had a big game against my. Emory Jones has had some good rushing performances. Everything that I had come to understand about the 3-3-5 would say, you know what? They are going to drop a lot of dudes in coverage, and maybe that's confusing, and maybe that's hard to get open, but you should be able to run the football. And for a team that really has moved the ball well, for them to not be able to do it and to not show a willingness to really try to do it was, I thought, sort of sobering. I kept thinking about, the Bearcats played a 3-3-5 and okay opponents ran it against them. Well, why can't this opponent run it against that 3-3-5? And I'm still not sure I understand why they couldn't and didn't.
So something else I noticed on Saturday, obviously I haven't gone back and watched the film, but Scott Satterfield mentioned that coming into this week, they'd been more successful with their outside zone runs. Where did a lot of their stops at the line come? On the inside zone. Mm-hmm. So if you're going into a game knowing that you maybe haven't been successful running the inside zone, you would think that the outside zone would be where you want to go. And I've noticed a lot of times they're running to the boundary instead of running to the field side. Have you noticed that at all as well? Where they struggle in limited space as it is. You would think they would want to run more plays to the field side where they have more space to operate. And granted, I'm not a coach. There could be schemes and reasons why they're doing that, but I would think with the type of speed and guys that they have, you would want to get your playmakers in space.
Yeah. I would agree with that. And by the way, I would also include some of the dudes they have on the outside. Like, when's the last time you saw like a field side jet sweep?
Mm-hmm.
They've got some athletes there. And we still may see it, but again, I hate to keep bringing up previous years. I think the one criticism of UC's offense that might be valid when they were winning all those games was, God, the running game, it sort of seems like it's, pound the middle. Eventually, Jerome Ford is going to break one. And I thought, okay, this staff they're going to bring more running game dimensions. And, specifically against the team that was begging you to run, we didn't really see that. Now, again, there could be very valid reasons why they're choosing to run to the short side of the field. But yeah, I've noticed that. I don't know how you couldn't, just given the way the teams have played them. But again, like this season, it's not like they've run the ball poorly. They've run the ball poorly in certain situations. They have shown an ability to move people around and move the ball on the ground. The fact that they didn't do it against Iowa State, again, very, very puzzling.
Yeah, I think we've pretty much hit on everything in terms of football. So we're going to move on and kind of switch gears a little bit. Talk a little Cincinnati basketball. The Bearcats were picked 11th by the coaches in the preseason poll. Reactions to the preseason rankings. I know you're not a guy that really pays too much attention on it, but what was your first reaction seeing them projected 11th by the league coaches?
Well, I don't pay very close attention. My guess is they were going to finish somewhere in the 10 to 12 range. Are you voting on the team the Bearcats have without Reynolds and Bandego or with? Like, we don't know. I mean, it's still, every Bearcat fan wants to know, are they going to have one of those guys, both those guys? I am of the belief that if you could somehow have both, that team will finish better than 11th in the Big 12, as good as the Big 12 is. I could certainly understand if they have neither guy, 11th might feel sort of optimistic. So we don't know. Like, I have a hard time reacting to it because what are we voting on? Are we voting on, are we voting assuming they're going to have neither, thinking they may have one, thinking they may have both, or assuming they're going to have both? And I'm sure there are other schools in the Big 12. You could say that about maybe waiting on hearing about a waiver being cleared. So I took it with a larger grain of salt than usual because these two, I think, likely impact guys. We don't know their status, and the first game is in 3 weeks, and I think the timing of that is absurd. But you know, I don't know if you sort of shook your head at the 11th. Being picked 11th, did you think they were going to be picked to finish in the top half? Did you think they were going to be picked to finish in the top 4? Like, where did you think they were going to go? Again, I have not sat down to rank the teams in the Big 12, but I thought somewhere in the 10 to 12 range, and they fit right in the middle.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting dynamic that, Wes will speak to the media on Wednesday, and he doesn't even know what team he's going to have, and we're 3 weeks away from the season.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at the roster, let's take Bandiago and Jamil Reynolds out of the equation. When you look at this roster and see all of the positional versatility that they have, what kind of options do you think that does give Wes if they do have to play a small ball lineup where, Vic is the 5 and they're running 4 wing/forwards out there?
Well, I would like to think no knock on anybody who was entrusted to run the offense last year. I want to think that Day Thomas can put teammates in a position where they can make plays maybe better than we saw last year. I love David DeJulius and I like Landers Nolly. And man, there were times when the offense really did flow the way you would like, but there were, especially against good opponents, it just felt like they were so limited. And I always felt like that was maybe a function of just kind of being limited when it comes to playmaking on the perimeter. So I'm hopeful that having 2 new point guards, obviously one who's older and has played more just college basketball, can aid in that a little bit. What I am most interested in more than anything else on this team is, do we see a significant year 2 leap from Daniel Skillings?
Mm-hmm.
Because, man, there were times last year you saw it, right? And then there were times last year you didn't see it. And not only did you didn't see him do anything. And you just sort of shrug your shoulders and go, that's kind of being a freshman, right? Well, now in the Big 12, does he make, because I feel like, having watched him last year athletically, for a guy who's still, really, really young in his overall basketball development, I think there's just such immense potential there. And if he starts to realize it as a sophomore, surrounded by a bunch of guys who have come from other programs and have played a lot of high-end college basketball, boy, what the things that they might be able to do if they have to play small are really, really interesting to me. And I know Wes was asked about this. I'm so intrigued as to whether or not he can make this big second year leap, because good God, there were times last year where you thought, God, you know what, if I can get this over the course of 30 minutes a night on consecutive games, holy hell. And then there were times where it was like he looked like he never played the sport. So I'm really, really interested from the standpoint of the guys who've come back from last year's team. Does that leap happen? And if it does, what could that mean for this team this year?
Yeah, I think Dan Skillings is definitely a guy that a lot of people are paying attention to. You look at what he did in that AAC game against Temple.
Yeah.
And man, if we get this kid this year, like he's going to be special. He's going to break out. 7 newcomers added to the roster, which it's crazy to think that's kind of the standard in college basketball now. Who are you most excited to see this year?
Of the guys that we know are going to play who come from other programs? Well, because the obvious answer is Aziz. I was in Orem, Utah for that NIT game, and I just remember going, not even having an inkling that guy was going to come to Cincinnati. Like, who is this dude here? And this was based on everything he did on the defensive end. It was like, who is this guy? Why is this guy playing here? Like, what? So a few weeks later, when you saw, he might come to Cincinnati, I got really excited. CJ Frederick, he's had such a hard time staying healthy. Look, he was a big part of an Iowa team that around Luka Garza ran some absolutely beautiful offense. Maybe Cincinnati doesn't have a Luka Garza, but CJ was a big part of that team, a team that was ranked in the top 5 for a large chunk of the year. He wasn't the best player on that team, but we're talking about somebody who went to a Big Ten program and then ended up at Kentucky. But he's had a hard time staying healthy. If he stays healthy, I am of the belief that that dude could be a difference maker. I think from the standpoint of just the collective of what they've brought in, I think you're being reasonable if you wonder how the pieces are going to fit defensively. But I do think last year's team, if you're looking at, okay, well, what things can we expect under this coach? I think what they were defensively in November compared to what they were defensively maybe in February, it got a lot better. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how some of those pieces fit. But I'm really hopeful for a healthy season from CJ, and if they get it, you get a really, really skilled offensive player. That who knows how things would have panned out at Kentucky had he been healthy. But if he is healthy, I think Bearcat fans are going to be really happy that he's here.
When you mentioned CJ's health, Wes brought up in his first preseason presser that his last year Kentucky, CJ was not fully cleared to play until the first day of practice in October, which is crazy to think when, in just a couple of weeks you're taking on a Duke, Michigan State, Gonzaga, and you've had less than a month to prepare physically for that grind. Season starts in a couple weeks. What are your thoughts on the non-conference schedule now that all of that has been released?
Well, I'd be lying to you if I told you I always like it when a big name program comes to your building early in the season for no other reason that it gets people talking about college basketball more than the schools that make up the bye game portion of the schedule. And that's obviously the Skyline Chili Crosstown Shootout's a different entity, and the Dayton game is a different entity. And Georgia Tech is an ACC program, but there is I always, there was a stretch there for years where, they played UCLA here and they played Tennessee here and they played Iowa State here. And, some of those teams were better than others, but they were schools you had heard of. And that doesn't mean that the teams that Wes is bringing to town aren't capable of being challenging. Hell, they lost to NKU last year there, so they're going to play them at Fifth Third this season. At the same time, the league schedule itself. I mean, the AP preseason poll. You have Kansas, you have Baylor, Texas is in there. I mean, it's absolutely daunting as hell, and so. You can only challenge yourself so much. The absence of an MTE, I guess, stands out. I'm not sure how that really unfolded, but I like it when a name brand school comes here if for no other reason, it provides a little bit more juice early in the season, and I think you get a better idea of what a team is when they play, especially at home. A school that brings some gravitas. I wish there was a little bit more of that, but you know, he's got a tough schedule when the league starts. So he's got a lot of newcomers too. So you want to be able to use the time to sort of mesh that team together. And also he has two guys that he doesn't know if he's going to have them for the first game. So it's hard for me to go too overboard and knocking the schedule. So yeah, I'm looking at it right now. I wish there was one bigger name school coming to Fifth Third. And again, that's no knock on Georgia Tech, but the league schedule itself is going to provide obviously no shortage of challenges.
Are you a fan of the neutral site game against Dayton?
Well, as a Bearcat fan and a Dayton grad, no, because it puts at odds two things I love. So to be completely honest with you, unless it was, in the NCAA tournament where one team is going to advance deep, and even then would be tough. I don't like it. I am a fan of on-campus, home court college basketball. And as much as I love some of the matchups we get in November and December, oftentimes they're in these faraway places where the atmosphere isn't great because students aren't there, bands aren't there, tons of fans aren't there. To me, the real essence of college basketball, when they moved the shootout downtown, nothing against that building, but the fun part of the shootout to me is trying to win on the other team's floor, which Bearcats haven't done in 20 years. I love the idea. Fifth Third Arena is so good, and UD Arena is so good. You have two great arenas, two great fan bases. Let's play a home and home. I don't want to get into the nuts and bolts of why they're playing the game. I get it. I just, if we're gonna do it in an atmosphere that represents, to me at least, what college basketball is supposed to be about. And I wish there were more high major games. Like we get these league challenges where Big 10, SEC, or Big East, Big 12, those are great because those are, Kentucky's got to go to Kansas, that sort of stuff. Houston's going to play at Xavier this year, which I think is those games are fun. Those are on campus. Those are in teams' home arenas. Yeah, the Champions Classic and events at Madison Square Garden and in New Jersey and all the different MTEs, they're cool. But what I love most about college basketball is the home court environment. And so if Cincinnati and Dayton are going to play, the people who put on the event are going to get mad at me. But I just, UD Arena is awesome, and Fifth Third Arena is awesome. We have two terrific arenas with awesome home settings. Let's see if the other school can go there and win, and then return the favor the following year. I wish we were doing that. But yeah, the emotional part of me, they've not played all that often over the last 25 or so years, but when they have, it's I'm not torn. I root for the Bearcats, but it's tough. Like I said to my wife, maybe it goes to show how much I care too much. Like, I really don't like it. I really genuinely don't enjoy those games, but I do want Cincinnati to win.
I think we'll end on this, Mo. What does, regardless of the waiver situation, what does success for you look like with Cincinnati's basketball program this season? And I know you mentioned earlier in the year, when it comes to March, I want to see Cincinnati still being mentioned on the bubble or in the field. But now that you have a better idea of what this roster is actually going to look like, what does success for you look like?
I'll give you three answers. The Super Bowl is February 11th, right?
Yep.
That is, we make fun of this and on my show all the time. The Super Bowl comes and goes, and then you have people who are like, "Oh yeah, I can start watching college basketball now." And it's like, well, there's one NFL game per, like, you couldn't watch college, you can't multitask. So when everybody else starts paying to college basketball and they go, how are the Bearcats doing? I want to be able to pull up bracketology, pick your favorite bracketologists, pull it up and go, there's Cincinnati. Maybe not in, but they're at least in the conversation. Start with that. Number two, have your name called on Selection Sunday. Like at the end of the day, it's got to happen at some point, right? So it's now been a while, man, and that's no reflection on any one person, but Cincinnati hasn't had its name called on Selection Sunday since 2019. I can't wait for them to scrape that off the plate. Like, I get that done. So that's the obvious one, right? If their name is called on Selection Sunday, that is a successful season. I think maybe a little bit more nuanced, although not that nuanced. Start winning games that you're not supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
If you have to go back to the Illinois game, Wes's first year, when they were getting clobbered in the first 8 minutes and then won by 20 points. Since then, when they've played, high major teams that they're not supposed to beat, or they play Houston or Memphis in the American Athletic Conference, they haven't won those games. The real sign of progress to me is you start to beat the teams that, Vegas says you're not supposed to. I would include Xavier in that mix, obviously. They have to go to the Cintas Center this year. Start to, you're not going to win all of them. You might not win the majority of them. And sure, you also, you might lose games that you're not supposed to. I think last year, that's almost how the schedule unfolded, right? They kind of beat the teams they were supposed to, and they had a hard time beating the teams that they weren't. I think if for no other reason, like just to get some juice, just to get some buzz, right? Just to get people talking about the program and make it feel like, here's this tangible thing that represents progress. Beat Kansas. It might sound silly, but go to Fall Allen Fieldhouse and beat Kansas. People will perk up. Go to the Cintas Center and win. Beat Baylor. Beat Houston. I think for all of the good work that Wes and this staff have done, and I think there's been a ton, and the recruiting momentum seems to be really, really good. I think there's so much to like, but I think even they would tell you that with the exception of Illinois very, very early, there hasn't been that signature win, right? And yeah, it's fun to look at recruiting rankings, and it's fun that the Jordan brand is back. But what really represents progress are these moments during a season where you go, oh, there we are, right? Those moments during a year where they beat who? There's no denying this schedule is going to present Cincinnati with a lot of those. Go get some of those games. And if you could start to get some of those, to me, that's really going to represent progress. Is that going to add up to an NCAA tournament appearance? I don't know. It's going to be really, really hard in this league. This league is stupendously good. But I want there to be a couple of moments during the season where you can point to last night's game and go, you know what? Wes's team didn't just hang in there for 30 minutes. They upset this squad. And, now it gets people talking about the program and the team, and it's tangible physical evidence of real progress. That's, to me, more than anything else, what I would like to see. And if you get enough of those, then hell yeah, on the Monday after the Super Bowl, you're going to look at bracketology, and there's a pretty good chance that you'll see Cincinnati at least as a possible NCAA tournament team a month or so before Selection Sunday.
I think the most encouraging things with Wes Miller and his staff is you've seen him, one, improve the roster every year.
Yes.
Two, recruiting has improved every year.
No question.
And three, they've closed the gap on Houston each year, which was the benchmark when they were in the AAC. Granted, the conference tournament game was, a blowout, but other than that, he's attacked certain areas that need to be addressed in order to continue the trajectory of this program. And I think that's encouraging heading into this first year in the Big 12.
No question. The Houston game over the last couple of years has been a barometer. And, frankly, they should have won the game at Houston.
Mm-hmm.
And for much of the afternoon, I thought they were. But, at some point to have really arrived, you have to turn those into victories. Like if you look at last year, you could say, well, okay, the toss out the NKU game. They should beat NKU, but they didn't. Who else did they lose to last year? They lost a game at Tulane when they stopped guarding. That was really, really frustrating. They lost at ECU, but, they lose at Memphis by 3. They were beaten all 3 times by Houston. Xavier beat them. They lost the home game against Memphis. Obviously the 2 games in Maui when they played Arizona and Ohio State. Arizona, they at times almost scored at will but couldn't get stops. Ohio State, they really didn't compete. Just start to get some of those. And again, maybe it doesn't matter, but I've said this to coaches, in this town, when you finally get this thing turned around, you're going to be amazed how much buzz there is for this program. You haven't experienced it yet. Well, you don't get it by, getting people excited about your recruits. You get it by putting up big victories, right? Mm-hmm. By putting up signature wins that really make you feel like, holy hell, this thing is going in the right direction. And again, the league will present with you no shortage of those type of games.
Right.
Start to get a few of them. And that, to me, more than anything, you need tangible signs of progress. The most obvious one is, do you make the NCAA tournament? But between now and then, you got to have some signature wins. You got to have some impressive victories that you can hang your hat on. And again, it sounds like a criticism. It's not, but since the Illinois game, in games that you would go into it thinking they're not supposed to win, they haven't won any of them. Again, some have been more competitive. The Houston game last year on the road, they should have won. Real progress is you start to win some of those games. Hopefully they do.
Well, Mo, this has been a lot of fun, man. I always appreciate you coming on. And I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Anytime, Ryan. Thank you.